Hello, this is Aaron, and I'm very honored to have on the show today a special guest. In fact, this may be the most special guest I've ever had on the show, and that is Stephen B. Clark. He is the author of the landmark book Man and Woman in Christ. Originally published in 1980, this book has never been equaled or surpassed as a treatment of Christianity and gender. So, Mr. Clark, thank you for joining me today.
Good. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
To give you an insight for those of you who are watching or listening as to how influential this book was, this is the book that changed Al Mohler's opinion on the theology of gender. So Al Mohler today is the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a big shot in that world. And this book, he has said, was very formative on him. I actually have a couple of different copies I want to hold up. This, I think, is the first edition, and it is one that I bought used on the internet after someone, I can't remember if it's Tim Bailey or David Talcott, told me I needed to read this book, and my mind was blown. And then here is the brand new version that was just put out by Warhorn Media.
That's right.
And a lot of the people who watch this or listen to my podcast are people who contributed to the fundraising campaign to get this book reissued. So to all of you who did that, I want to say thank you very much. And if you want to buy a copy, there is a link to how to do so in the show notes. So again, thank you so much for joining, Mr. Clark.
Thank you.
A few things people might not know about you. So I'm going to list off a few things that I think I know, and you can tell me if they're right, and then we'll probably maybe explore them coming through. The first is that you are Catholic, which is not obvious from reading your book. As a Protestant myself, when I read the book, nothing in it made me think, oh, this guy's a Catholic. It really reads in a lot of ways like a Protestant person would have written it. A lot of appeals to Scripture, etc. But you are Catholic. You're also very involved in the Catholic Charismatic renewal movement, as was my mother, by the way, so I will maybe talk more about that. You live as part of an intentional community called Servants of the Word, and were a key figure in creating an international network of intentional communities called Sword of the Spirit. And I believe you are also yourself I don't know if you've sworn a vow of celibacy, but you have maintained celibacy, if I'm not mistaken. So did I get all of that right?
Yes, although it's probably worth noting that it's the sword of the Spirit, really, that's the intentional community.
Okay.
And the servants of the Word is like a subgroup within the sword of the Spirit. Okay. And it's a celibate group, but the sword of the Spirit is mainly families.
Okay.
And it's international. So a lot of the people in the sword of the Spirit are in Philippines, Lebanon, South Pacific, different places. They're all over the world. We're in about 30 to 35 countries, and we keep adding countries. So last year we added 2 countries. We have a small group now in Brazil. We have a small group in Peru. And I think we might have added one in Turkey. We already have a couple of them in Turkey, but I think we might have added another one, but I'm not sure. But anyway, we grow steadily, and it's all over the world.
What's the website for that group again?
Sword of the Spirit.
Sword of the Spirit.
Yeah, I think you have it, right?
Okay, I'll make sure I add it to the show notes so people can check that out.
Okay.
If they want. The thing that really impressed me about the book when I first read it, and maybe this is a Catholic thing because Protestants don't tend to do this, but it was a very comprehensive look at the subject. You do talk through all of the scriptures, and you do go through all of the historic church practice, but you also include a survey of social science literature in fields like anthropology and feminist studies. You also talk about modern ideologies and their impact, as well as kind of modern technological society. How did you decide to include this very, very comprehensive look as opposed to maybe a more narrow theological look?
Well, I suppose it probably has to do with how I think we need to come at this issue. Uh, I don't think narrow, denominational theological stuff gives us a very clear or very adequate view of men and women roles. Scripture is much broader, but especially as you've observed before in other environments, wherever it was that we were talking previously, uh, it's the modern world that's what we're dealing with. And uh, if you just focus on church differences, for instance, then you're going to focus on what do you do in the church service? What do you do with particular churches' dogmatic stands and so on? Whereas, in fact, what we're dealing with something that I think pretty clearly applies to all the churches who really, or not just churches, but groups too, groups that aren't churches. Uh, the issue really is how are we going to live what we got taught in the scripture? And I would say the majority view in Christian tradition, how are we going to live that in the modern society? And just to get at a little bit of a church doctrinal point of view or theoretical point of view doesn't get at the real issue. And the real issue is we're dealing with the modern world and we're dealing with all the modern ideologies. And if we don't address that, we're not really addressing the issue as most people experience it. So that would be my view of the area.
I agree. So much of our world is different than any of humanity has ever experienced as a result of some of these transformations that you document. And the scriptures, were written in a very different era. And so thinking about how to apply that in today's world requires a lot of thought. And one of the things that you really talk about that I think is so key, but that we seldom think about, is how we transformed from a traditional society to a technological society. So, what is a technological society, and how is life today different than in those traditional societies that most humans lived in throughout history?
Well, I noted from your interview on your website of the book the distinction or the question of what term to use. Technological society. I think you more standardly use industrial society. They're the same thing from my point of view. At least that's what I'm trying to address. And the what technological or industrial society involves is a fundamental change in how social relationships are function nowadays. And the focus of the change in technological society or industrial society, I'll use the term technological society because that's the term in the book. Uh, the focus of the change is that what a society, most traditional societies, not just ours, but all kinds of traditional societies, most of them uh, function a fundamentally relational way. But what happened with the technological society is the focus became more technical, more functional, uh, more oriented to how to be more effective, efficient in how you get tasks done. And society as a whole is ordered that way. The main groups in society are task oriented groups. I mean, they don't say it that way,
Mm-hmm.
but they're trying to accomplish some set of functions, and it's a fairly limited set of functions. Each group and even the countries, the nations, uh, the, uh, the way they're structured is to try to get things to happen in a functional way so that society goes more efficiently. And one of the chief places where that's gotten applied is in human life. And part of it has to do with being able to live at a higher standard of living and be able to accomplish more things like what we're doing now. I mean, this you couldn't have done this in traditional society. Uh, we're relying on technological society to have an interview and a discussion uh, over many miles,
Mhm.
and we're talking about stuff that goes over centuries. Uh, this is the result of technological society, but underlying it all is a restructuring in the way most relationships work in society nowadays. Not all of them, but most of them work that way now.
So we've gone from essentially a society of relationships, like family or guild or whatever, tribe, clan, to functional relationships.
Right.
How does that affect us from a gender role perspective?
Well, the gender, the way this is what's been increasingly uh, coming on in modern society because of a lot of it sociological, but also because of movements like the feminist movement or the communists or whatever it happens to be. The approach is to be more functionally effective, to be more efficient. And to be more efficient usually means that the task is defined in a relatively narrow way. And so uh, the way our society works is there's a lot of organizations or groups. In theory, they're all under the government, but that's a more complicated issue. But the net effect of it is there's a lot of groups in society doing a lot of different things. They are sometimes unified, sometimes not unified, but they're focusing on getting certain things done, getting them done in the most functionally effective way.
Yeah. Your chapter on technological society and what that means for authority and what that means in terms of who does roles, that's worth the price of the book right there. I don't know that I've read a better explanation of that, even though there are a lot of people who've tried to take a stab at talking about these transformations of society. It really does kind of explain it and helps us translate it in between kind of traditional and today's societies in a very plain English manner. I think it's really great. Just I'd love to just send people that chapter and say, read this chapter. That'll tell you a lot about the world. And there's lots of chapters that are similarly insightful, I think.
Yeah, well, I think the that's perhaps the key one in the book. Uh, I think another one that's got to go along with it is the ideology chapter,
Mm-hmm.
because that's the one that picks out all the things that are working on people's minds about how to think about social issues and social results.
Right. We didn't really have ideologies as we understand them today until
No.
maybe the 19th century or something like that.
Well, I would I would personally tend to uh, say that ideologies became prominent in the 18th century.
18th century. Okay.
Yeah, the French Revolution, even the American Revolution was a start, but especially the French Revolution, and then all the
Mm,
things that ramified from that.
mm.
That's the place where I would put the big change in terms of ideologies coming in. And the French Revolution was built on an ideology. Uh, we don't tend to think it that way because we tend to use the same terms, and
Hmm.
the some of the ideological positions are background to how we think about things, but that whole kind of nest of things uh, has really influenced a lot of our life.
Right. Liberalism, I guess, is an ideology.
It is an ideology, yes. And one of the reasons why Americans have so much trouble with dealing with it is because they don't think of it as an ideology. They think this is just the right way things should always work. But that's what everybody who has accepted an ideology tends to think. They think their ideology is the right way for things to work.
Well, hopefully this gives you enough of a teaser to want to go out and buy the book, because there's that and there's a lot more. And we'll maybe talk a little bit more about the book as we go through the conversation. But I want to talk a little bit about you and how you came to write such a remarkable book. Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in New York City, which, one wants to grow up in New York City. It's the center of the world, right?
Right.
The capital of the world. It's where the United Nations is set up. No, I'm just joking, of course. I mean, it is those things, but New York City has got a lot of different elements in it, and the is relatively a small part of how New York City functions, and a lot of it is uh, culturally different from group to group and place to place. And then also you've got the overlay on it of the various kind of ideological approaches. So New York City was a very diverse place, uh, and I don't think I realized it while I was growing up in it. But one of the effects of it was that it sort of educated me in an early age of how different a culture might be. So you can start on the lower tip of Manhattan uh, with Battery Park and the New York Harbor. Uh, Very quickly, you have a certain kind of culture there. And then you move from neighborhood to neighborhood. You have a neighborhood where people mainly speak Chinese, quite
Mm-hmm.
close to that. You have another neighborhood that used to be an Italian speaking neighborhood. It isn't very much anymore, but there's still a little Italian core. You keep going on. You can find a Ukrainian neighborhood. You can find a German neighborhood. Uh, you can find I think I said Chinese, but there's all kinds of, there's a lot more neighborhoods. And if you go from one to another, everybody can speak English. That's the way, that's the sort of lingua franca, the way people are supposed to communicate with one another. But when they get into their neighborhood, they frequently don't talk to one another in English. They often talk to one another in Chinese or in Italian or in Spanish or whatever. So the New York City presents a certain microcosm of the world. And one of the things you learn, I think, if you're able to pay attention to such things, but one of the things you learn is you go from neighborhood to neighborhood and the culture changes. It's not just the geography that changes, but the culture changes. And how things work in a Chinese neighborhood, how they work in a German neighborhood, how they work in a Spanish neighborhood, uh, actually Puerto Rican neighborhood, I suppose. Uh, those are all different culturally, not just geographically, but they're different culturally. And if you learn how to deal with more than one neighborhood, you've already started on dealing with the cultural changes in the world, because you learn very quickly that things work differently in one neighborhood from another neighborhood. Again, not in the overall view necessarily, but the way people approach life.
Yes, New York, even today, New York is like a third foreign born. And probably when you were growing up, it was incredibly dominated by, immigrant groups of various stripes,
Right.
again, Jews, Italians, etc. Where did you fit into this New York kind of ethnically, culturally, religiously?
Uh, that would be pretty hard to say. The one Long Island. I lived 1 block away from the city limit, but uh, I was I was in Nassau County, and just across the major highway, which was Jericho Turnpike, or also called Jamaica Avenue. Bizarrely, it had two different names. The south side had one name, and the north side had another name. So I lived right near there, and the it was a suburb. It wasn't the city. It was a suburb. Even now, I think you'd consider it a suburb. So when I grew up, I was living in really a multicultural, multinational suburban neighborhood, and some of those neighborhoods were culturally unified, but a lot of them weren't. And where I grew up, it was I don't even know how I could characterize it now.
Were you always Catholic?
No, no, I became a Catholic when I was in the university,
Okay.
but that was also, I would say, uh, that's the point I became a real Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I had my parents, our family was not a religious family, but my parents, being good Americans, thought that all the kids, there's only two of us then, and thought that the kids ought to be exposed to religion. So they sent us to Sunday school for a couple of years. And it wasn't enough. I wouldn't have said, looking back on it, it wasn't enough to make me a genuine Christian, but there was real Christian influence. And that somewhat disposed me when I got to the university to become part of the Catholic Church, but also the Sword of the Spirit, which again is ethnically diverse, but it's because of the charismatic renewal.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of different influences as I grew up.
Where did you go to university?
Yale University
Oh,
in
you
New
went to Yale.
Haven. Yeah.
So, not a lot of people probably, much lower shares of people went to school back then, and Yale is very prestigious. You must have been quite bright. Um,
Well, I suppose I got a scholarship. I actually I got a General Motors scholarship, but part of what happened before I got into the university, I had to figure out where I was going to go to the university and how I was going to pay for it. I got some money from my family, but I didn't come from a wealthy family. It wasn't a poor family, but it wasn't wealthy by any means. So I had a well, I had a choice. I got to a choice by my own decision, I suppose, between Harvard and Yale. And then also there was the question of the scholarship. And there was a National Merit Scholarship and a General Motors Scholarship. And I ended up choosing Yale, not Harvard. And I ended up choosing the General Motors Scholarship, uh, probably because it paid more. It was I got my way through university for basically on the General Motors Scholarship, and it was enough money to allow me. I went to Europe for a while, and it was enough money to allow me to travel from country to country and live in Germany and all that kind of stuff. So those turned out to be key decisions, going to Yale rather than Harvard, as I saw after more experience, and then also getting a General Motors scholarship.
yes. So, someone getting offered a National Merit Scholarship, even if you chose not to accept it, shows that you were definitely at the top of the heap in terms of smarts. And it shows in the work that you've produced, too.
Well, you would see the same thing for the General Motors scholarship.
Yeah.
It was a high academic scholarship,
Yeah.
both of them. It just paid more.
What did you study at Yale?
I studied history and philosophy. My major was history.
Did you go on and get like do graduate studies or get a PhD? I hadn't seen anything.
Yes, what I did is I went to Yale for 4 years. Because I had gotten the General Motors scholarship. Uh, they paid my way to go to Europe, so I did a year in Germany. When I did a year in Germany, I also spent a lot of time traveling around Europe. So I spent a decent amount of time in France, some in Spain, some in England, UK, and so on. So I I did I did yeah, well, I got what my scholarship was when I went to Europe was in philosophy. So I went to Freiburg in Germany because at that point of the reputation of Heidegger, that was enough to cure me of Heidegger. Uh, I I came out uh, partly because of the people I related to who were also not enthused about Heidegger, but partly because just seeing how the whole thing worked. Uh, I left without the enthusiasm that many Americans have for German philosophy. Uh, there were very good things in the German philosophy that I studied, but also some waste of time. So I went to a year in Germany and visited other countries. Then I went to Notre Dame. Uh, at Notre Dame, I did a degree in philosophy. Uh, and I had passed all my exams uh, for a degree in philosophy. And then the Charismatic renewal hit, and our community got started. So my time from then on got diverted into charismatic community stuff. Then what happened is that I had 8 years to write a dissertation, but I never found the time. We spent all our time with, I mean, I in 1940 our community started. The Charismatic Renewal uh, came to Michigan, came to our part of Michigan a couple of years before that, maybe 1938. Uh, so by the time I started, or in theory, was supposed to start working on my dissertation, I was just plunged into charismatic renewal. We had huge growth. Within 3 or 4 years, we were filling football stadiums. It was a big time for charismatic renewal revival, and it affected a lot of the country. And then also, we started the community, and the communities take a lot of work. They One of the reasons why a lot of groups that now call themselves community don't get very far is because they don't put the work into getting something like a community to happen. So I never did finish my dissertation. I have a master's, but I don't have a doctorate. But I did pass all the doctoral exams.
Well, you're not the first person that happened to. I think that's quite common to have
Really?
people just yeah, that
Really?
they people just don't write their dissertation or move on to greener pastures. I know
That's
multiple people who were in that situation. But
no,
your work, I mean, I asked that because your work is very scholarly and very rigorous. When you read this book, Man and Woman of Christ, it's very well researched, and you obviously did the work to understand what you were writing about.
well, I did, I think. But one of the things that's worth observing, you can see it in the preface. There were a lot of people that worked with me to get the book done, especially to do a lot of the research. See, I had, by the time the book came out in 1980. At that point, I was just about 40. I was 40. Uh, the there was a By then I had done a lot of teaching for our community, so I was the one in a way that was responsible for developing the teaching in our community. We have a fairly extensive set of courses. I haven't done all the courses, but there's a fairly extensive set of them, and I was responsible for the area. So I did a lot of teaching, and I did teaching on men and women stuff because that was, the 1970s was the point at which the whole feminist movement and all the kind of change going on in that area really impacted our country. So I had done teaching on this. I had pretty much covered material in Man and Woman in Christ, but in the form of courses, not in the form of well developed writings chapter by chapter. And then I had a team of people that worked with me, uh, partly developed the courses. But see, what happened in the 1970s, that was the time when they started trying to promote or get the Equal Rights Amendment to pass. And there was a big resistance to that, a lot on the part of a lot of the women who quickly saw that what the Equal Rights Amendment would do would be to take away a lot of their privileges, the way in which the government had supported them as mothers, as family members, and so on. So a lot of them, like you think of Phyllis Schlafly and some people like that, they were the opponents. It was women mainly who were the opponent to the Equal Rights Amendment. I think most of the men maybe didn't want to spend very much time on it, but the women did. So it was a big issue. And what we did, the leaders in the sort of the spirit said, we need to do something about this. We should write something to give a position, our position, about how you deal with men and women in Christian life, Christian community. So, because I had done work on it, I got elected. So I worked on it, and then there was a team of people who helped me. That's one of the things I think doesn't come across so well in the interview that you did with Joe Bailey. It was a good interview, but what doesn't come across so well is that there was a whole team of people working with me, and especially on the research side. So I didn't do all the research in the book. As some of the people observed, that would have been a huge job doing
Right.
all the research.
You're making me feel better now because I'm like, how could you have possibly researched all this stuff? This is like amazing.
Yeah, I couldn't. Well, see, it's worth reading the preface of
Yeah.
Man and Woman in Christ because uh, toward the end of the preface, I outlined the number of people who worked with me on the book. And it was a fairly sizable number of people. There was a smaller group that did a lot of the work to get it together. And then there was a larger group of people who gave a lot of input. And both of them were fairly diverse. And especially the input, you got people from a lot of religious traditions. So the book was designed, the Sword of the Spirit, right from the beginning, was what we call ecumenical. That is to say, it was oriented to people involved in churches who wanted to stay in churches, although it had a number of people who didn't want to stay in churches. But the Sword of the Spirit is predominantly people who are connected to a church, perhaps the majority is Catholic, but it's not just Catholic. We have a lot of Protestants, we have a lot of Orthodox, we have a lot of non-denominational people in the Sword of the Spirit. It's fairly diverse in terms of church relations, but we do have a core of stuff that we accept in common. And so part of what we've been doing in the Sword of the Spirit is working on how do you get people from a variety of church situations to be able to have a common community and a common way of life. Now, one of the things that made it easier, bizarrely enough, one of the things that made it easier is that the churches don't have much to say about men-women roles. They
like to say as little as possible if they can.
Often that's the case, and then they ask what do they focus on, and that has some kind of ecumenical difference, church differences, some issues about the worship service, who can give talks. Now, that's worth paying some attention to, but that's not the main issue with men and women roles. Just giving talks in church services, or who's gonna be the pastor, or that kind of stuff. So we very early developed what we call an ecumenical approach, which was a way of taking people or accepting people from a variety of different church traditions, and often not church traditions. We did a lot of evangelism and connected to a lot of people who were not connected to churches. But we did a lot of working out how you could get a group of people from different churches to live together in Christian community. And one of the things we discovered fairly early was the churches don't fight over that stuff. What they fight over is the church service or the church structure, but they don't fight over how you live as a Christian in daily life. And especially they don't fight over men-woman roles, which is one of the places we took a stand. So we had relatively few problems with church relations in terms of how we live together in the community, which is surprising to people, but that's the way it was.
Yeah, I mean, what you said in there was something that I think a lot of people would find a shocking statement. This idea that who gets to be the pastor or who gets to give a sermon or a talk is not the center of gender roles, because especially in the evangelical world today, that seems to be the sole part of the dispute. Gender roles have been reduced in a lot of cases to who gets to be the pastor, who can be ordained, and is the husband the head of the home. And that's basically it.
Well, you can throw in also who gets to teach the members of the church.
Yeah.
And a lot of it isn't just in the church service, it's in whatever else they set up. So there are some of the Protestant churches who will take a very strong stand saying it's the men, or either the pastor or the men, who should teach the women, which, as I'm sure you know, that's not what the scripture says, actually. Yeah. It's the women, the older women, who should teach the younger women, and I presume the older men who teach the younger men. So there's already a gender difference in how you conduct forming people to live a Christian life, and it's not all dependent upon the ordained leaders. And within the church it is, but in most Christian communities it's not. And one of the things that's happened in our society, it used to be that people separated in terms of how they lived by church. So the Catholics would have a place they'd live, the Lutherans would have a place they'd live, there'd be a Lutheran church, and they'd interact with other Lutherans, etc. But what we ended up doing was saying, it would really be a lot more effective if you could get all the Christians together to be somewhat united in how they live, that they support a common way of life, which is basically keeping the commandments, living according to the scripture instructions about how people should relate to one another, and that became, for us, that was the focus, and it allowed us to be able to take people from a variety of different churches who wanted to join. So we normally get people. I mean, every year. Well, it depends. I mean, I think it's probably clear to you, but we have We have what 30 to 40 full communities. We probably have 125 communities, which many of which the rest of them are underway. That is, say, they're in the process of connecting to us, hopefully, or sometimes they drop out. But and then they're from all over the world. We're in pretty much every zone of the world. Not every country, but every zone of the world. So what we were able to do is to come up with an approach to how we lived Christian life in what we considered was the really important stuff in the modern world, and that included gender roles, or men-women roles, or however you want to describe it. And and we found that there was almost no church teaching on that. They disputed about the Eucharist. They disputed about ordination. They disputed about certain kinds of teaching, but they almost never disputed about how they were going to teach people to live their daily life in the modern world. It seems bizarre that they didn't, but they didn't. And that's part of what allowed us to develop the way we did.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. I want to dig more into this community aspect, which I think is very important to understanding the book. I didn't fully understand how important it was when I first read the book until I learned later about these communities that you have. But I want to back up and go back to this Catholic Charismatic renewal movement, which a lot of people may not know about. So to kind of set the stage, what was the Catholic Charismatic renewal movement?
Well, I would presume that people would basically know what charismatics renewal stuff is. That is to say, it's got something to do with baptism in the Spirit and spiritual gifts. That's the way that people often pick out the essentials. Now, that's not all there is to it, but that gives you a certain kind of focus. The Catholic Charismatic Renewal began in the 1960s. Would that be I think the date we usually give is 1968, with the Duquesne Conference. But the Catholic Charismatic Renewal began in the 60s, but it built on the Cursillo movement, which was the renewal movement that already pre-existed. And the Charismatic Renewal got started by Cursillo leaders who were looking for more spiritual strength and vitality than they were getting normally, even within the Cursillo environment, although the Cursillo environment was pretty good. So the Charismatic Renewal got affected by the Cursillo movement. It built upon the Cursillo movement. It actually, a lot of the stuff about how we relate, how we build community, and so on, a lot of it was stuff that we learned in the Cursillo movement. So you had some different stages of different renewal movements. Same thing was happening in the Protestant churches. What in the 70s, or the 60s, uh, we found out about the charismatic renewal, the charismatic dimension, or however you want to describe it, and the people we were able to find out about it from were Protestants. So there was already the neo Pentecostal movement, I guess is what it was called at the time, had started among Protestants. There was an Episcopalian group that was maybe the most prominent one at that point, Episcopalian, Anglican, depending on what country you're in. Uh, there was some other kinds of groups, as well as a lot of non-denominational groups. But what we made contact with was this neo-Pentecostal movement. And from that, we found out about charismatic renewal and some of the essentials of charismatic renewal. So that was also one of the sources of the Catholic charismatic renewal. And interestingly enough, when the Pope gave a talk uh, encouraging the charismatic renewal in the Catholic Church about 3 years ago or so, uh, what he said was one of the most important things to remember is that this, which we consider to be a very valuable Catholic movement, was started by the Protestants, and we learned how to do it from them, which that doesn't get quoted often among especially the conservative Catholics. But in fact, that's what the Pope said, and he was right. I mean, it came from the Protestants who were already there and already in churches. Now, we didn't connect solely to the ones who were in churches. One of the influences, for instance, back then was the Full Gospel Businessmen, which is a non-denominational group. But there were, especially in the Anglican or Episcopalian Church, there was a whole movement already going on with a church affiliation. So when the Catholic Charismatic Renewal began, it built on that foundation.
Yes, didn't it start somewhere in the Midwest? You mentioned Notre Dame. Did it get started like around Notre Dame or Ann Arbor? Or?
Well, there's always a little bit of discussion about that. People will say it started in Pittsburgh at Duquesne University. That's reasonable, but it had somewhat pre-existed. The people who started it in Pittsburgh at Duquesne had already been involved with charismatic things, both at Notre Dame and in Ann Arbor. So there was a number of things going on, and the background to it was in a certain way the Cursillo movement, because the people who started the Catholic Charismatic Renewal, for the most part, were Cursillo leaders. Or
what was that movement you referred to as this Cursillo movement? I'm not sure what that is. Can you spell that for me? I haven't heard of it.
Cursillo.
Okay.
That is to say, it's the Spanish word.
Cursillo movement. Okay, now I get it. Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with it, so I didn't go.
Well, that's one that at that point was just in the Catholic Church. It's now ecumenical, so you can find an Anglican Cursillo movement, the Lutheran Cursillo movement, and so on, and they're somewhat connected to one another. But back then, it was just the Catholic movement. As far I think I remember it that way.
Well, I was interested in where it started because, I live in Indianapolis. I'm a Midwest guy, and I've spent a lot of time studying the Midwest, and we don't get a lot of credit for much innovation. So I'm always looking for interesting things that happened in the Midwest. And, I can count Pittsburgh as part of the Midwest if I need to.
Well, you can count Notre Dame, South
Notre Dame,
Bend.
certainly Notre Dame.
And
so
Michigan's only one state over.
Right.
So the original start of stuff really was Midwestern. It wasn't East Coast or West Coast, although it very rapidly spread.
Yeah. I am too young to have remembered what was really going on at that time. But my family was Catholic on both sides. I was actually baptized Catholic. And in the early 70s, my mother got involved in the Catholic Charismatic renewal movement. And it ultimately led her and a couple other people that she was with to leave the Catholic Church and become Protestant Pentecostal. So I was actually raised in a rural Assemblies of God church. But the Catholic Charismatic Renewal movement is kind of was very formative in my mother's face. I know she would say that's when she became a Christian genuinely,
Right.
was through the Catholic Charismatic Renewal movement. I'm
Right.
curious if this has, just given the timing of when it happened, did this have any overlap with or thing to do with the Jesus movement?
Well, people often confuse them.
Mm-hmm.
They were somewhat, and they merged in different ways. So, yes, it had something to do with the Jesus movement. Uh, both of them can be hard to define, and the Jesus movement is, I think, even harder to define than the charismatic renewal or the Cursillo movement. But yeah, they were linked together.
And these intentional communities came out of the charismatic renewal movement, right? So they were sort of an outgrowth of that.
Yeah, they were an outgrowth of that. They were also an outgrowth of the Cursillo movement. The Cursillo movement was sort of an intentional community. It had a structure, it had groups, it had a somewhat unified relationship. It was international. At that point, it was all Catholic when we got started, but not too long afterwards, the Cursillo movement started moving into Protestant churches, or Protestant, well, churches, I suppose, but people who belonged to churches. So it was all these things. See, this was a time when there was a lot of stuff going on. As society was getting more secularized, a lot of the Christians were getting more concerned about how to form Christian life in a way that could succeed in a secular environment. So there was a lot of stuff going on in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, and a lot of them kind of overlapped in ways that were, how should we put it? If you're going to write a history, it's nice to have them nice and neat and distinguished from another, but it's very hard to do that with what was going on in the 70s. And you got to throw the Jesus movement in, the Cursillo movement, the charismatic renewal, full gospel businessmen, etc., etc.
Yeah, there was a lot going on. Again, I was too young to know it directly, so I kind of have to just know it through its after effects, or by reading about it. How, when people talk about intentional communities or communities, that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. How is sort of the spirit structured in terms of, do people live together? You already said they don't necessarily go to church together. Some people share all property in common. How does yours work?
Well, we have a lot of variety, actually. Part of the way the Sword of the Spirit is put together is we allow different groups to have somewhat different approaches from other groups. So there's a certain amount of variety, but there's a lot of unity. Uh, we have conferences, for instance, that have representatives. Well, sometimes they're representatives. If they like the leaders' conferences, they have representatives. Some of them are just members. Like we have very large youth conferences and so on. Usually by region. So there's a North American one, there's a European one, and so on. More than one, I suppose. So each church, each community, well, let's say it this way: there's a set of common decisions about how you live the Christian life that applies to every group that's official, sort of the spirit group. So we keep the commandments. We have interpretation of what it means to keep the commandments. We keep the commandments. We have a certain amount of common decisions that say this is the way you have to live the sort of the spirit way of life. That's not just simply commandments, but it's a way in which we keep a common orientation in a secular society, which is most of our people live in a secular society, even the ones that are in countries that are supposed to be of all one church.
Mm-hmm.
The world, by and large, now is made up of secular societies. Not everywhere, but most places. So we have some decisions. You can't have a gay marriage. The marriage has got to be between a man and a woman. The generations have to be linked in some way. So the family isn't just a couple. The family is intergenerational. In every location, the sort of the spirit community usually has people from more than one church, more than one community. So there's a fair amount of diversity, and some of the diversity goes by community. So each community can make its own decisions in everything that's not decided by the sword of the Spirit. But then there's a unified approach to living the Christian life in the modern and the world, which involves keeping the commandments, believing the truths of the faith, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, all that kind of stuff. So we have a common set of things that all the communities have to accept, but then they have a lot of different approaches in how they're going to do different things. So there's a mixture of unity and diversity, and the unity is remarkably more effective than you think it should be, given the diversity that we have within the sword of the Spirit.
What draws people to want to be part of this community?
Now, I guess the question has to do with this community.
Mm-hmm.
What people are usually drawn to is a particular community.
Mm-hmm.
So there'd be a community in Washtenaw County, there'd be a community in East Chicago or wherever, be a community in Costa Rica, there'd be a community in Lebanon, etc. Each community is somewhat separate from the others, distinct, somewhat separate. I mean, each local group organizes itself as a branch of the sword of the Spirit, and they're not required to do everything the same way. So there's a common set of things that we do. Keep the commandments, for instance, which might not sound so surprising, but nowadays that's one of the key things.
Right.
So there's a common set of things we do, but then each community has the freedom to develop in certain ways. Sometimes it's got to do with church-related ways. We have some Catholic communities. We have some Lutheran communities. We have some Orthodox communities, Syrian Orthodox, etc. So each community will, and then it's also ecumenical communities. So there's different ways the communities relate to the churches, and if they're going to be members of the churches, sometimes they're church-related communities without being officially members of it, but sometimes they're officially members. So if they're officially members, they would do things that's required within that particular church or denomination. So we have a common set of things that unifies us and does so particularly rather effectively. It surprises me actually sometimes how unified we are. For instance, maybe a month or two ago, we had a wedding of somebody who came from a North American community, someone who came from a Scottish community. The family moved to Scotland or went to Scotland, but the husband and wife were from different continents. They were, I think, the same church. I'm pretty sure they were the same church, but they didn't have to be. But there was a marriage that were from people from different continents, different countries, different cultures in various ways, but they had very little trouble having a process for getting married, because there is one in the Sword of the Spirit. If you're going to be a Sword of the Spirit member and you want to get married, you have to follow the process. So
is it like counseling or something like that you have to go through? Or?
Well, it's not. You need to be, at some point, you need to be a member of the Sword of the Spirit, which means you get the formation, the basic formation that everybody in the Sword of the Spirit gets. But then there are different things about the process of getting married that we have some decisions about. So the man and the woman need to get to know one another. They can't get married right away. They can't just get married because they fell in love. They have to become a member of the Sword of the Spirit. If they're not, usually they are, but they have to become a member of the Sword of the Spirit, which means a member of their local community. And then they need to go through a process of how a couple gets married. There's decisions in that process. They have to decide how are they going to raise the kids. They don't have to be from the same church. We tend to encourage that, but we don't require that. So some of our marriages are interchurch marriages. But there is a process. They have to work. If they're not from the same church, they have to go through, answer a certain number of questions. How are they going to raise the kids? How are they going to handle sexual issues connected to marriage, that kind of stuff. So there's processes for how to get married. It works simpler if they're all from the same country, if they're all from the same church. It's more complicated if they're from different continents, if they're from different churches, etc. So we require them to work out a set of things before they get married about how they're going to handle some of the church issues, for instance. That's part of our process for getting married, and people who are from different churches have to go through the process. Well, everybody needs to go through the process, but it involves people from different churches working out certain of the issues, and we usually tell them what the issues are. I mean, not that we're coming up with the issues, but we're going to say, if you're going to be a Catholic, Anglican, whatever, these are the kind of things you need to be clear on, and you should be clear on it before you get married, not have a conflict once you're married.
Right.
So we have a process like that.
When Amy Coney Barrett was being nominated to the Supreme Court, there was a lot of coverage of her community in South Bend called People of Praise.
Right.
Is that related to you all, or is it similar?
It's similar. We were the same community once, and then they separated. So the People of Praise is a group of communities almost completely in North America, almost completely in certain parts of North America, although they do have a group in Trinidad or one of those kind of islands in the South in the Caribbean. But they're mainly a North American group. They're similar. We started together. We do a lot of things together, but we do a lot of things, some things differently. So I wouldn't say we have a very close relationship, but we have a broadly friendly relationship, and in some places it's pretty close. So, for instance, in Minnesota, our community in Minnesota sends or tends to encourage the families to send their kids to the school that's run by the People of Praise group in Minnesota. So there's some interaction and cooperation, but it's not like we have a lot of the two groups don't cooperate a great deal. So it varies again.
So this is great background because I want to come back to where we left off when I started asking you about the Catholic Charismatic Renewal Movement, which is really about the book's discussion of how men and women live and fulfill their roles within a Christian community. And there's an assumption there that there's an actual Christian community, which I
Right.
think would have certainly been true at the time the Bible was being written, certainly true at various points throughout history, but in many cases is not true today. The church has become another
Right.
functional organization that
Right.
we go
Exactly.
to for very narrow purposes.
That's right.
And so I really appreciated that you linked the idea of men and women living together as something that happens as part of a community. And if you don't
Right.
have the community, you're already kind of behind the game here.
Well, see, a big part of what we do is we form communities. We start new ones. We support the ones that are part of the Sword of the Spirit. There's a whole system by which we help communities to develop and be stable and do well. They can't fight one another. They might disagree a bit. There might be some tensions, but they can't fight with one another. They have to be unified on the fundamentals and so on. So we start communities, we form new communities, we have a unified approach to strengthening the communities that exist. We have a process for bringing groups into the Sword of the Spirit, and in that process, they form a community or they don't. Sometimes they join, we have movements. We don't just have communities, we also have movements. The movements don't have as much commitment and involvement, but they're frequently linked with the Sword of the Spirit. The movements will often send their young people to Sword of the Spirit conferences and things like that. So we give the movement some help. But we're mainly a group of communities, and to be a group of communities, people have to accept the essentials of being a Sword of the Spirit community. Does that get at what you want, or you want to?
Well, I'm just curious a little bit more on the. It's less about your community itself than I guess maybe the more broader Christian world in America and how we've disconnected conversations about gender roles and actually disconnected church from community, and how that's left us with these very narrow definitions around, for example, can a woman be a pastor or not be a pastor? Because those are the only real functions in dispute.
Right. So, yes, I agree.
So I think it's something that I would just encourage people as they read the book to think about that in the context of Christian community and the idea that you have a vibrant community life.
Yeah, we consider
that's just
the community very fundamental. What we are is communities. We're not churches, we're communities. The churches were church supportive, but our nature is to be a community, and to be a community involves living together the Christian life, keeping the commandments in the middle of a secular society. Well, for most part, secular society. That's the largest thing that we environment that we're in the world, and it's the yeah. I think I lost track of how what we were starting. You were just
Yeah,
reminding
well, I
me
think
what.
you were just talking about. Yeah, I don't know. There was anything we had to cover. It was just that your description of community, I think, is so key,
Yeah,
and it's something I think that we've we've lost. Things tend to go in cycles. Has been my observation. So, in the '70s, there was also the Back to the Land movement that was very big, and my family again was part of that. And then it kind of went away for a while, and now it's back. Like people talk about homesteading,
that's right.
and I think this idea of community is something like that. Community was very big again in the late '60s and the '70s. People were trying to create these communities. Then people didn't talk about them as much, but now I see that people are talking about community a lot more and intentional communities. I know you're familiar with the Bruderhof
All right.
communities, and they've become sort of a celebrity group among a
Yeah,
certain class of Protestants. Now they've got
that's right.
a lot of money to make themselves celebrities, so they've got a good media budget. But I
Yes,
think
they
it's
do.
something that people are asking about a lot more as we realize, wow, we've kind of lost out or missed something here.
Yeah, well, see, one of the things that we try to do is to have positive, mutually supportive relationships with other groups that are similar to what we are. And the Bruderhof would be one of them.
Hmm.
Like I've been to several of the Bruderhof communities. Uh, we've connected to them in Latin America. We've connected to them in Europe. So uh, that would be one group that we would consider to be friendly. You know, I would also say the Amish are communities, uh, and we would be similar in certain respects to the Amish. We don't see the Amish don't. They're funny. People tend to think that they're tightly unified in the way they live their life. They are unified, but I would say they're not tightly unified. So uh, the just a second, I'm having a oh,
I can hear you still.
I know, but my battery is running low because I'm on Ed's computer.
Oh, okay, okay, yeah.
Uh,
Well, we can wait, maybe we can skip that because I was just about at the end anyway.
okay,
And I only got a couple more questions actually. One is, what reaction did you get to the book when it first came out?
it was very positive. Uh, now, positive not to the feminist sorts, but very positive in sort of broadly in the Christian environment. Uh, you quoted like Newhouse's
Hmm.
input. That would be an example. In fact, you look the way you the Warhol Media has put it out. There's a whole bunch of different inputs that people gave at the time, and most of them were very positive. We got a positive review in Christianity Today.
Oh wow,
Yeah, they wouldn't do it
they
now.
wouldn't do it now, that's for sure.
I would think not, but we were one of the books of the year for the Christianity Today people. Uh, so yeah, it got a pretty positive review. Uh, not certainly not universal, but then there's a number of groups that we tend to be friends with and interact with and do stuff with, like the Bruderhof would be an example. the Amish, actually, in certain locations. The what else? Duhath's group.
Mhm.
We have some certain interaction with them. Uh, there's a number of groups that are trying to be communities in a way that we would consider recognizable.
Mhm.
Now, community is a very broad term these days. A lot of groups would call themselves communities. A lot of churches call themselves communities. Most of them we wouldn't recognize as being communities in our sense. Most of these groups, the ones that aren't enough community.
Okay, well, it looks like Mr. Clark's battery died on him, but that was the last question. I just want to say thank you all for joining. It was an incredible honor to have Mr. Clark on. And Stephen B. Clark is the author of this incredible book, Man and Woman in Christ, an examination of the roles of men and women in light of the scripture and the social sciences. I'm going to put a link to buy it in the show notes. And I'll also put a link to the Sword of the Spirit communities in the show notes. Thank you all for listening, and I will talk to you on the next show.